The final season of Attack on Titan has left me with a lot of complicated feelings and thoughts. None of them have to do with the ending being bad. I know a lot of people didn't like it, but I think it was a proper and logical end of the series. This season has a lot more to do with human nature than any threat of extinction at the hands of the Titans, as it delves deep into the history of bad blood between Marley and Eldia. We get a second look at the world outside the walls, only this time from the perspective of Rhyna Brown as we see his role in Marley's ongoing war against several allied nations. Of course, shortly after Marley's victory, they're pressed with yet another issue. Eren Yeager takes center stage by declaring war upon the entire world. This is in accordance with his plan to protect the people of Paradis by obtaining the power of the Rumbling and using it as a deterrence against the world with the threat of total annihilation. Of course, Eren isn't the only one eyeing the power of the Founding Titan, as Zeke attempts to use it for his own purposes and wipe out the Eldian bloodline for good by taking away their ability to reproduce. The final act of the story is largely a commentary on the fact that human nature is the core of all conflict, and that it will forever lead to cycles of violence and reprisal. There's the overarching feud between Marley and the Eldian people over the sins of the Eldian Empire that drives Marley to seek the extinction of the people within the walls for the fear of the use of the Founding Titan's power. Then there's the Jaegerists, whose desire to survive drives them to conclude that the genocide of the rest of the world is their only option, and they are content to adopt very xenophobic ideologies. There's the Eldians outside the walls, who blame the people of Paradis for the way they're treated and seek to establish themselves as quote-unquote the good ones in the eyes of the world. And there are a few other factions in this, but they don't play such major roles. All of these groups have a fairly legitimate claim to their course of action. Marley suffered at the hands of the power of Eldia for centuries. However, the current people of Paradis have no connection to the sins of their forebears other than by descent. Since they took no action against Marley themselves, they see Marley's attack against them in Shiganshina as the first act of aggression and claim to have been wronged by the world beyond the walls. In order for all these groups to come to a peaceful reconciliation, they would have to set aside their grudges and bad blood and never see true justice for many of the sins of each party. Effectively, any ending where this gets talked out would require both sides to give up on all the blood that had been spilled. And if only one side was willing to talk and walk away from the battle, the other side would use that as the opportunity to slaughter them without mercy. Hence why neither Marley nor the Jaegerists could ever back down. It's a sadly all too realistic interpretation of human nature. It takes the idea that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, and demonstrates how human hatred brings this principle about. Again, resolution without further bloodshed would have required a great number of people to forget a great deal of evil. Something that, regardless of the morality of it, would have been very hard to get entire nations on board with. Because of this simple fact, the final season becomes a mess of gray area that questions the morality of human conflict and the reason we continue to devolve to violence when we're clearly capable of other methods. By the time the whole show is over, you can no longer see where the line clearly stands between good and evil of all parties involved. Every character has their sins, some more than others. But you can clearly see that many of them aren't purely evil in intention by how they approach the problem. Yes, Zeke's sterilization plan is cruel, but he's approached this whole situation from the point of view that Eldia is the root of all the evil. He thinks that with Eldians gone, the world will be a much more peaceful and safer place. But his whole outlook ignores the fact that Marley has practically risen up to become the new Eldian Empire, with a thirst for the same kind of conquest as their old enemies. The Jaegerist plan to wipe out the rest of the world is particularly heinous. But from their point of view, they're hated for sins they never actually committed, and their very lives are at risk because of things their ancestors were responsible for. If they were to stand down in this situation, they'd be sitting by knowing they'd eventually see everyone they love slaughtered. And if you're already viewed as a monster, what's the harm in acting like a monster? Hell, even those who end up doing the right thing, knowing full well the consequences of their actions, the defectors who head out to stop the rumbling, have the blood of far too many people on their hands. From destroying entire towns to cutting down their own comrades, these people bear their own burden of guilt. For what it's worth, the story delves into many complex issues in satisfying ways. Isayama does a really good job at using his characters to tell the tragic story of human conflict and the cost of the endless hatred humanity expresses. It's a gut-wrenching experience in the end as you come to realize the heroes of this story were on the same level as many of the villains you'd watch them conquer up to this point. And that the idea of a happy ending where everyone rides off into the sunset and lives happily ever after in this situation was far beyond reach. Even if you only look at the surface level story, it's still very well executed, so I don't understand why people are so upset over the ending. The fact that you feel for the villains and heroes alike in this one shows just how well Isayama humanized everyone. There isn't a character who doesn't fit into the story, who doesn't feel compelling, or who feels like they were just there for plot to happen. Even those who I noticed were particularly hated by the fandom had really good character arcs. It's one of those stories that will leave you with a lasting impression, which I consider to be the mark of great writing. But that brings us to the production side of the series, and honestly, there were some problems. None of which to do with the music, which I thought was really good this season, with intros being very addicting. From My War to The Rumbling or to outros like Under the Tree, we had a lot of good music, plus parts of the soundtrack have been perpetually stuck in my head like Footsteps of Doom. On the other side though, animation has some hiccups. In the time between Season 3 and the final season, production rights for Attack on Titan changed hands from Wit Studio to MAPPA, and while I normally commend MAPPA for their work, this one was a pretty obvious downgrade from the quality of the first 3 seasons. The Nine Titans went from largely 2D animation that looked really good to almost entirely 3D CGI that looked mediocre by comparison. Plus, the change in art style did some of the characters pretty dirty, especially Mikasa. Honestly, she looked pretty in the first 3 seasons, but something about the way MAPPA handled her design made her look straight up masculine, and it was hard for me to count her as feminine, aside from the boobs. Similar things can be said about how the changes in the design of other characters didn't quite look right as well. But of all the things I wanted to talk about in this video, there is one more that I do want to touch on a bit here. The tragic character arc of Eren Yeager. If you've seen the series, Attack on Titan has a very depressing ending that will leave a bitter taste in your mouth. And I think that's what set a lot of people about it. The way things played out left a lot of them unhappy with the overall story, but I'm going to put that aside because that's a big topic. Eren Yeager as a character is one that was profoundly tragic in my eyes. One whose whole mentality is reflected in the lyrics of the second opening to the season, The Rumbling. It goes something like, all I ever wanted to do was do right things. I never wanted to be the king. All I ever wanted to do was save your life. I never wanted to grab the knife. And there's more I could go on, but I will spare your ears and the sanity of me trying to sing this myself. The song effectively encapsulates the fact that Eren was a naive fool who thought the world beyond the walls was some vast expanse to be explored, not a living hell in human conflict. In seeming denial of that fact, he came to the conclusion that the only way to save the people he loved was to commit to starting the Rumbling and wiping out the rest of humanity. This decision was ultimately cemented by the infinite loop of memories he unlocks at the end of Season 3. Yes, by the end of the story, Eren admits to the fact that he's been experiencing countless iterations of the same scenario, and each one ends with him starting the Rumbling and flattening the world. He struggles with this fate, even hoping to convince himself that the world outside deserved it, or that there was another way. But in his mind, everything he would try had already failed. All his paths were blocked. That's what his memory was showing him. And if given the choice between saving those closest to him or standing by for the greater good, he would choose his friends. He had no good outs in this situation. He was doomed to lose in one way or another regardless of his choice. It's a profoundly depressing character arc. One I argue is on a different level than many in manga and anime. There's a lot more to dissect about it, but I'd have to make a separate video about just that subject. And on that note, it's time to put an end to this. The final season gets a 9 out of 10. My only gripes are with the animation, and since the story was so damned good and perfectly executed, it's hard to devalue this show much more than a single point. It's excellent, and it has become one of my favorite watches. But that's enough said. If you liked this video, please consider hitting those magic like and subscribe buttons, because those simple but free actions do really help me. Hit the bell while you're at it too. And if you have any thoughts to share, please put them down in the comments. I hope to see you in the next one. Later.